guys, this is Jessica and Noam here for another episode of What's That Sound? Today we are breaking down the sound of Even Flow by Pearl Jam.
The drummer was Dave Cruson. The original mix was done by Tim Palmer. They then remixed it with Brendan O'Brien 20 years later. We're going to talk about the differences between them and figure it all out.
For our drums today, we had our 70s Gretsch kit, a Ludwig super light snare, and then we also had a Ludwig vintage Black Beauty layered on top of that. For our cymbals, we used the Zildjian K-Dark hats, Zildjian medium thin 18-inch Dark Crash. For our ride cymbal, we had a Zildjian K-Sweet 21-inch ride.
Okay, so for this drum sound, it's very interesting in that there's a lot of elements of this that are really traditional for the time, right? In the 90s, they had kind of dialed in a bit of a drum sound for a lot of these, you know, grunge-ish bands, and they were doing a lot of multi-miking, a lot of relying heavily on direct mics. There was still a little bit of like leftover 80s stuff in terms of digital reverbs being a really significant part of the sound. And what's peculiar here is that we have two versions of this recording. We have the version that was the original with all of those 90s tools used. And then we have a much more modern version mixed by Brendan O'Brien in the 2010s, I believe, that was kind of the same energetic thing, but using more modern choices and trying to get the same energy without using the tricks of the 90s. Let's go through the mics. The miking is pretty standard, and then it's really in the processing, in the mixing, and in the balancing that the differences between these two mixes kind of come out. So for the kick drum, we used a pair of mics, pretty standard. On the kick in, we used an M88, fantastic, well-balanced, modern-sounding kick drum. Lots of good high-end and good click and attack from the beater. On the kick out, we used a FET 47 clone by Sound Deluxe. And combined, they just give us all of the elements of the kick drum that we could look for. On our snare drum, super standard, SM57. We used a little bit of a 1176 just to kiss it with some compression on the snare top. And on the bottom, 57 as well. We phase inverted the bottom snare mic, and we made sure that the two mics were exactly equidistant from the snare so that they locked in perfectly. On toms, again, super standard, 421s, very well-rounded tom mics, and also dynamic mics that do a good job of rejecting the cymbals. On hi-hat, we had a KM84. For our overheads, we used a Bill Bradley recreation of some C12s. Beautiful, well-rounded, big mics that pick up all the drums in addition to the cymbals. For our room mics, we went for a spaced pair of Coles 4038s. These are beautiful room mics. We were compressing them a bit with a Chandler TG1, which is a really, really punchy compressor. It really brings out the length of the rooms. We also had a mono room mic, which was a 47, and we were smashing that up with an 1176. So the last thing that you'll hear in this mix is there is, in fact, samples on the snare. Those samples could have come from anywhere. They could have recorded them. They could have been something that was previously recorded. At the time, triggers were kind of a new concept, right? The technology was very, very recent that you could trigger something off of something else. So you can hear them adding samples into just the chorus of these mixes. There is a deepness that comes in the choruses that are not in the verses. And that's likely just a snare drum that's tuned further down that is just being used to reinforce those choruses and just make it feel a little bit larger. To do this, we recorded our own samples. We took a Black Beauty in the room, recorded one hit of it. We used Trigger 2 to trigger it off of the snare drum that we recorded. And we're, again, just using a little bit of that just to make that chorus open up. We're also using it to trigger some of the reverb to make the reverb get a little deeper in those choruses. We've got all our standard miking. We go to mix it, and in the 90s, there are some mixing trends that are going to dictate what the sound is going to be. Everyone notices when they listen between the two mixes, right? Between the old Pearl Jam mixes and these modern new Pearl Jam mixes, they're noticing the reverb, right? That's the most apparent thing. They were using very like 90s digital reverbs at the time. This was probably a 480L or a 224, these Lexicon digital reverbs. It might have been a Lexicon PCM 60, 70, 80, one of those things. Oftentimes they were layering multiple reverbs together to get the drum sound. Because the reverb was so much of a part of that sound, they would lots of times like layer reverbs together. With that, they also were relying on the room mics less, and they were relying on the direct mics a little bit more. The feeling of being able to hear an individual direct mic and have it really poke out and hear the mic individually rather than just as like a part of the bigger kit. That was a trend in the 90s, right? There's a lot of recordings from that time that you can really hear, especially snare drum mics and kick drum mics. You can hear the way that they're mic'd, and it does not feel terribly natural, to be honest, but it's really impactful because it feels very, very close, right? It feels really, really right in your face. And when you couple that with fake reverbs, all of a sudden you get both the closeness and the impact of this direct mic, but you also get this length, right? The length is coming from these reverbs. The result is a big sound, but it's a really, really stylized sound, right? And those records all, they very much feel of an era, and they became kind of dated sounding pretty quickly because that trend of those really loud direct mics and those really intense reverbs kind of went out of style. The way that they were compressing things at the time was also a little less intense than it is now. Records were less loud in the 90s, and so they did not have to compress the drums quite as much, so they left a bit more of the transients in. They did not have to do quite as much parallel compression, things like that, to bring out the sound. They were kind of leaving the dynamics a little bit more natural. When Brennan O'Brien went to mix this and he did a more modern version of it, immediately we pull away a bunch of the reverb. And that creates a little bit of a problem in that the drums had all this length that were dependent on that reverb. The obvious answer to that would be to turn up the room mics, and that's what you can hear that he did, right? The room mics are definitely more present. All of the direct mics seem to have gotten turned down a bit. That will only go so far. And the other thing is that as you turn up the room mics, you're also turning up a bunch of trashy stuff that comes with it, right? A lot of harshness and cymbals and things like that are going to dictate the limits of how loud you can turn up these room mics. And so Brennan O'Brien also went with some techniques that are more modern feeling techniques that are gonna also add length and energy in the way that the reverb would have. Parallel compression will do this. If you compress this drum kit really, really heavily, and you use it in parallel, right? Not just listening to the compressed sound, but listening to the compressed sound with an uncompressed sound. The result is that every time the snare drum hits, as the snare drum is decaying, also the compression is pulling everything up beneath it, right? As the dry signal gets quieter, all of a sudden, what are you left with? You're left with the compressed signal because that does not have the same dynamics, right? That stays loud even when the drums get quiet. The result is you add all of this length. It sounds like the snare drum is way longer than it used to be. It sounds like every time you hit the toms, they end up way longer than they were originally recorded. And the result is kind of similar to the decay of a reverb, right? If you add all of this length to the snare drum with reverb, all that energy would be lost, but we kind of make it up with this parallel compression. It does a good job of making it feel like how a drum kit would sound in a room rather than how a drum kit would sound recorded. The 90s mixes, you can really hear the recording process in it. You hear all of the individual mics. In the Brendan O'Brien mix, because they've turned down a lot of those direct mics and because they've brought out a lot of these room mics instead of these artificial elements, it feels much more just the way that a drum kit feels in a room rather than the recording part of it. There is a tiny bit of reverb in the Brendan O'Brien version still, but it's just to add a little bit of width to things and just hype up the snare drum a little bit. It's not particularly noticeable. That was Even Flow by Pearl Jam.
Thanks so much for watching, and as always, please let us know in the comments what other songs you'd like to see us break down. We'll see you next time.